I've spent 22 years now at the Marble Nut House in Salem, and so you learn a little when you spend 22 years at the Marble Nut House in Salem, and so I am happy to continue to do what I do and to try and help folks like you and the property owners and the home builders and farmers and ranchers and anybody who utilizes property for a living or just happens to own a single-family home. My job is to try and defend your rights to make it easier for you to do what you're doing, which in this state, as Sean alluded to, is somewhat of a difficult task. We have, I'm gonna split my presentation into state barriers versus local barriers, and the topic of my PowerPoint is, I got stuck with zoning and regulation, which is fine. I'm a land use attorney by trade, and so I've done this for years, and so I know all about zoning and regulation because it's, I guess, an occupational hazard. But we're going to split into state barriers and local barriers, and we'll start with the state. I was at I delivered UGB 101 in Bend to a group of realtors a couple of weeks back. And the first thing I asked people was, do you know who LCDC is? And there was probably 40 people there, not as many as here, but a pretty good crowd. I was surprised by, and I won't ask you to do this, but I was surprised by the number of realtors who didn't know who or what LCDC is. You really, for your industry and your profession more than any other, except for us land use lawyers, you need to understand what LCDC is, because that commission has the ability and regulates every square foot of land that you sell or buy when you or help the buyers buy. LCDC stands for the Land Conservation and Development Commission. It is a 7-member commission of people appointed by the governor. They are not elected. You probably don't know who they are, and you probably don't know much about what they do, but you should at least have a working understanding of what they do. They were created in 1973 with the passage of Senate Bill 100 when Oregon switched from a local zoning plan like the other 49 states have to a statewide centralized model, and LCDC was created at that time. The commission enacts goals and administrative rules that carry out those goals, and the rules that they enact have the same force and effect as statutes passed by the legislature. So they enact goals and rules, and every city and county and the regional government in Portland Metro is required to implement the goals and the rules that are created by LCDC. They all relate to land use. And so basically we have a state-driven land use model where 7 people who you don't know that were appointed by the governor set the standards for every city and county in the state. There are 19 statewide land use planning goals. For our purposes, we really, for this purpose, for when we're talking about barriers to housing, excuse me, and I'm talking about urban housing, not rural housing, there's really 6 goals that we need to know. We've got goal 1, which is the citizen participation goal. We've got goal 3 and 4. Those are the ag and forest land goals. Those apply to areas outside the urban growth boundary. We have goal 5, which is the natural resource goal. We'll talk a little bit about that. Goal 11, urban services. How do cities provide, ensure that there's an adequate level of urban services to serve the development that they're proposing? And goal 14, which is really where we're going to start today, and goal 14 deals with the urban growth boundary. In fact, goal 14 created the urban growth boundary. So we'll switch up and start talking about 14 now. This is the language from LCDC's Planning Goal 14. What it did, or what it does, is it requires every city and metro for the Portland metropolitan region to establish an urban growth boundary. Urban growth boundaries shall be established and maintained by cities, counties, and regional governments to provide land for urban development needs. And really, here's the key, and here's what the urban growth boundary's primary function is: to separate urban and urbanizable land from rural land. So you say, okay, what really is it? Well, what it really is, the urban growth boundary, is an invisible line drawn on the map. It's made through a political process, and it's nothing more than an invisible line drawn on a map. You can find it in the city's comprehensive plan map. And what it does is it separates urban uses, rural or commercial, industrial, residential, urban residential, from rural uses, which are predominantly, or actually almost exclusively, going to be agricultural and forest uses. It also marks the boundary between who has jurisdiction. So land inside the urban growth boundary is typically, the planning jurisdiction for that land is typically the city, whereas land outside the boundary, the planning jurisdiction is typically the county. And so if you want to build a house on 40 acres in a farm zone, you're not going to go to the city to get approval to do that. You're going to go to the county. Likewise, if you want to do a 240 lot subdivision in Beaverton, you're going to go to the city of Beaverton and not to Washington County. That's not always the case, but that's typically what one of the functions of the urban growth boundary. So how do we ensure that we have, and this is when we're starting to talk about barriers, how do we ensure that we have adequate land for housing inside the UGB? As most of you know, the Willamette Valley has been growing steadily and significantly for the better part of 20 years. The Portland metropolitan area, we've averaged over the last 20 years about 300,000 people every 10 years, and that's been steady for 20, actually going on 30 plus years now. People like to move here. We have the opposite problem of my friends over on the east side. If you get over into eastern Oregon, into Burns and Ontario and Baker City and places like that, they're actually losing population. We're trying to figure out ways at the capital to make it easier, to change the land use system, to make it easier for those folks to increase population. Over on this side, we're trying to make sure that the cities have enough land inside their urban growth boundaries to accommodate the demands made on them by everybody that for some reason wants to move here. And so back in 1995, the home builders, John Chandler on behalf of the home builders, led and got through a bill that created ORS 197-296. That particular statute requires all Oregon cities with at least 25,000 people to maintain a 20-year buildable land supply of land for residential needs. So Albany, Corvallis, Salem, Metro, Eugene, all of the bigger cities within the Willamette Valley are required by state law to have 20 years of buildable land supply for residential needs. And they do that through what's known as a buildable lands inventory. They'll do a housing needs analysis, and based on their housing needs analysis, they'll determine what they need for their buildable lands inventory. And by the way, even though the statute doesn't apply to employment lands, LCDC also has a rule which requires the cities to have sufficient land for employment lands as well. So what do we do when we're a valley city and we need additional land for housing? The cities really have three choices. The first one is that they can expand the urban growth boundary. That sounds easy, right? Well, we'll talk about that. The second thing they can do is increase the density, so they increase the number of units that they can build within their city. That sounds pretty easy too, right? Well, we'll talk about that too. Or the city can do a combination of both 1 and 2, and that's typically what you'll see when you have boundary expansion issues, is cities trying to do a combination of both 1 and 2. Now number one, we talked about expanding the boundary. When we do that, when a city tries to do that, we start talking about goals 3 and 4. Goal 3 is the agricultural lands goal, and it states very simply, ag lands shall be preserved and maintained for farm use. Well, a 240 lot subdivision ain't farm use, is it? And then we've got goal 4, And Goal 4 says to conserve forest lands, the goal of Goal 4 is to conserve forest lands by maintaining the forest land base. Now remember, these goals were adopted in 1975. In 1975, timber was the king, the primary industry in Oregon. That's changed significantly, but the goals haven't. So how much land do we have in Oregon? How much is zoned for farm and forest use? And the answer to that is damn near all of it. And this is LCDC's numbers. These aren't stuff that Cleve and Jillian's and I made up on the back of a napkin. According to LCDC, 97% of all the privately owned land outside of UGBs is zoned for farm or forest use. That's 97%. So when you go outside of the urban growth boundary, 97 of every 100 acres of privately owned land is zoned for farm or forest use. And then in the valley, I think the numbers in the Willamette Valley are even higher than that. Now you've got a little bit, every county's got a little bit of rural residential and maybe a speck or two of rural commercial or industrial. Typically they're rural commercial and industrial lands are lands that were devoted to that type of use prior to 1973, so they just got dumped into a rural commercial or industrial zone. And the last bullet point here is the key. Urban development is inconsistent with farm and forest use. So when a city goes to expand its urban growth boundary, especially in the Willamette Valley, they're going to have to expand onto farm and forest lands, and LCDC takes a very dim view of expanding onto farm and forest lands. So we've got 3 and 4 as sort of, well, wait a minute, maybe you guys shouldn't do that. Now we move on to state planning goal 1. Goal 1 is the citizen involvement goal. I hear more about this at the Capitol than any other goal, I think. The point of Goal 1 is to encourage public involvement in land use decisions, a laudable goal, but we've managed to take that to the extreme in this state. We accomplish Goal 1 in Oregon, there's a number of statutes that accomplish Goal 1. They make nearly every application from keep going back to my 240 lot subdivision application in Beaverton, to a husband and wife that want to put a ag building out on 800 acres in Harney County. We require just about every land use application, no matter how big or small, to go through a public process, and it's a multi-level review. It's done at the local level, so you have a decision, you submit an application, you have a decision made by, either a decision or a recommendation made by staff. That can be appealed to a planning commission or a hearings officer. That decision can be appealed to the city council or the board of county commissioners. And from there, that decision can be appealed to LUBA, which is the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. That decision can be appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals. And that decision can potentially be appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. And that, again, that's for just virtually every type of land use decision that we have. And anyone who shows up, whether you show up in person, whether you submit an email, whether you send a letter, any person that shows up and comments, whether they're in support or in opposition, has automatic standing to take that case all the way up through the ladder. And if there are 78 criteria that you have to satisfy in order to get your approval, and the city demonstrates that you've met 77, but they make an error on the 78th one, the whole thing comes back and you start from scratch. So it is, I think, putting it kindly, we have gone overboard with Goal 1. Now that's not an easy argument to make at the Capitol. But we make it all the time. So who takes advantage of Goal 1? The answer is NIMBYs. I assume most of you know what a NIMBY stands for. They're also known, by the way, as friends of whatever. So I guarantee you, if you are in a hearing representing an applicant, which is basically all I do, and someone shows up and they say they are from the friends of something, they are not your friend. there is 100% certainty that they are not your friend. They are probably a NIMBY. A NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. I'll give you an example. I had a case in Forest Grove last year. We were in front of the Forest Grove Planning Commission. My client wanted to do a 3-lot partition on about a 7,000 square foot lot. The property was zoned for multifamily. So actually what we were doing was density at the very low end of what was called for in the multifamily zone, but we were doing a 3-lot partition. It was the first one in the neighborhood, 1950s neighborhood, houses on 7 to 10,000 square foot lots. And of course, the neighbors went absolutely nuts, formed a Friends of, it was 35th Street, I think, Friends of 35th Street. And they proceed for about an hour to tell the Planning Commission what a horrible person my client is for wanting to do something that's entirely consistent with the zoning of the property. By the time we were done, we ended up getting our approval, but believe me, my client learned a real lesson real fast about friends. So, you all know what that is, right? I won't spend time talking about that on my slide. That's a banana. Bananas I refer to as the Hezbollah splinter faction of the NIMBYs. Bananas go by, you'll see a banana, they go by the name Land Watch. That's kind of an ominous term, isn't it? You know, Land Watch, you know. Bananas stand for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, all right? They make the NIMBY groups look tame. A side point on that before we move on. Never buy property next to a NIMBY or a banana. Never. So now we go to Goal 5. Goal 5 is the state's natural resource goal: scenic views, open spaces, wetlands, riparian areas, historic resources, open space, and rock pits. My buddy Angstrom, who's my fishing buddy, the two Seans know him. His dad got rock pits out of the Goal 5. It was a smart move. That was smart. But anyway, which one of these doesn't fit? I would say rock pits, but they're in there. Local governments have to adopt Goal 5 inventories, and they have to regulate their significant resource sites. So that's the point of this slide for you. Typically, you will find most of the larger cities have local wetlands inventories, and they regulate their wetlands through Goal 5 and through DSL. And so when you go to develop your property, you have to look and see whether there's a Goal 5 overlay on that property. Portland has the environmental protection and the environmental conservation zones. A number of cities have those, especially cities that aren't interested in growing very much. So again, we get back to our question: if a city needs to grow, what does it do? Well, it can increase density or expand the boundary. The problem with that is, as you know, increasing density is very unpopular, and expanding the boundary is also very unpopular. And you've got goals 1, 3, 4, 5, 11, and 14 to deal with. So there we've got our governor. You probably know that guy. That's former Governor Kitzhaber. I didn't always agree with Governor Kitzhaber, but I totally agree with this statement. This is a quote from Governor Kitzhaber: "There are two things Oregonians hate: density and sprawl," which makes it a little tough when you're representing an industry that's trying to figure out how to get more houses built for all the people that are moving here, and all of us that are having kids or grandkids that want to find a place to live as well. Now, you'd think after we talked about that'd be all we'd have to worry about, but you're wrong. We have DSL, the Oregon Department of State Lands. They, in addition to the cities and counties under Goal 5, DSL regulates wetlands. I am on a DSL Rules Advisory Committee right now where they are talking about significantly altering the way they do off-site mitigation, wetlands mitigation. They require, typically on a large-scale project, an individual delineation of that site. We have cities that should have local wetlands inventories that don't have local wetlands inventories because they don't have the money to do them. And so you find yourself buying a property and you go to the city and you say, are there any wetlands on this? And the city says it's not on our local wetlands inventory, or we don't have one. And then you go to submit your development application, and they require you to do an individual delineation for that site, and all of a sudden you find that half the property that you purchased contains hydric soils and therefore is classified by the state as a wetland, and then you've got problems. We have DEQ that regulates stormwater permits. I don't deal with them as much. I'm sure Mike deals with them all the time, but I understand that they're kind of torturous on some of those issues. We've got SHPO, which is a State Historic Preservation Office. They deal with historic resources. Now we got local issues. We've talked about the state issues and all of those folks. We've got local issues. We've got SDCs, system development charges, which Mike is going to talk about. We've got exactions when you submit an application and the county or the city approves your application, but they say, as a condition of the approval, we're going to require you to give us a strip of land in the front of your property for street improvements or a bike path or something like that. We're not going to take it. We're not going to pay you for it. You're going to give that to us. We took an exactions case out of Tigard, Dolan versus City of Tigard, to the U.S. Supreme Court in the early 2001. Then we have local zoning issues. We've got the Goal 5 inventories we talked about. We've got tree ordinances. We've got height restrictions. We've got site design. We've got setback requirements, et cetera. And then, by the way, in a number of cities, we used to, until the three of us and Chandler changed this a couple sessions ago, we had voter-approved annexation requirements where even if you got your approval from the city to come into the city so that you could receive services so that you could develop your property, that decision had to go to the voters for approval. We were able to get rid of that a couple of sessions ago, but nevertheless, it was a problem. So how are we doing? And then I'm done. Housing permits, Oregon averages approximately 19,000 housing permits a year. The state economist says we need 25,000 a year to keep up, so we're falling behind annually, and we have a current shortage of 100,000 plus and growing. So as long as people keep moving here, we need to do something about it. We need to make it easier for housing to occur, but as my legislative buddies will tell you, it's tough to do in the Oregon legislature. Taking on the land use system is sacrilege to a number of folks in this state. And unfortunately, the only way we're going to be able to fix this problem is to take on and fix the land use system. So that's what I have to say, and that's what I'll keep doing at least until I get old enough that they kick me out and tell me I can't come to the Capitol anymore. Thank you.